everybody, it's Mark Crowley. I'm back with another How to Draw video. Sorry it's been so long since my last video. I am in the middle of creating a new graphic novel and it is just taken up all my time. But I promise there will be more videos to come in the months ahead. Today we're going to be talking about page layouts for comic books, and I'm going to show you two different ways of laying out the same page. Now this first one is going to be the most straightforward version of the layout that I can think of. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels, all of them just squares. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in and all in time lapse. Maybe just going to do the first 2 squares, as I said, in this really straightforward way. But let's look at this script, this little piece of script that I've come up with. And this is what I would do if I were creating a comic book for myself, and I would just be writing this for myself, for my own instruction almost. Man is sitting at home reading. The doorbell rings. Ding dong! He goes to the door, opens it, and finds that it's a local boy from the neighborhood. And the man says, "David, what are you doing here?" And David says, "You said someday I'll take you fishing, so here I am." And the man says, "I said that yesterday. Someday doesn't mean tomorrow." And some of you may recognize this is a little bit adapted from one of my books, The Drawing Lesson, a similar circumstance that I had in that story. But what I'm going to do is take these opening lines here and start to translate them into comic book form. And as I said, I'm going to do this in the most straightforward, first thing that pops into your head way possible. And then when we get to the second version, we'll be seeing hopefully slightly more creative ways of doing it. So I'm going to do this all in time lapse, the first 2 panels. Okay, so here you see the first 2 panels, the way I've done it, in pretty much the most straightforward way possible. And if you look at what I originally wrote, man is sitting at home reading, the doorbell rings, ding dong, he goes to the door, opens it. Well, we haven't gotten to the opens it part, so that kind of stops right there. In terms of what I have illustrated. And, by drawing the character from head to toe, it almost feels like a stage play, like when you're in the theater, you see all the actors from head to toe, a little bit from the side like this. This is what I mean by a very straightforward way of doing things. And in a minute, I'm going to come back and maybe try to be a little more creative. But this is certainly a legitimate way of doing comics, and the advantage of it, very easy to understand. No one's going to get confused here in terms of what's happening. All right, let's move on to the next 2 panels. Okay, so I've got these panels 3 and 4 here that really just go into that next little bit there. He opens the door and finds that it's a local boy from the neighborhood. "David, what are you doing here?" Now in the first panel, I chose not to show the boy's face. I suppose I could have put a little hint of that there, but for now let's just leave it so that there's a mystery in this panel, and then we see him in the second panel. Notice, even in time-lapse, you probably saw that I got the words in early, and I like to do that. I like to leave space for the words before I do all the drawing. And the truth is, I would do a very rough version of this before even getting to this stage, so as to accommodate the speech bubbles. I think that's very important, and that's a big part of my process, is not waiting until the end to drop in the speech bubbles. If you put them in first, then you know how much space is left for the artwork. But again, we continue to see everything from the side, right? Which again, to me, has this sort of stage play feeling to it. Very easy to understand, no danger of being confused, but to me, just a little bit dull, this way of presenting the scene. Still, let's continue basically using this same approach and finish it up with the final 2 panels. Okay, so here we have the final 2 panels with the David saying, "You said someday I'll take you fishing, so here I am." And this so far nameless middle-aged man, "I said that yesterday. Someday doesn't mean tomorrow." This is not meant to be like a standalone strip that would make you laugh. This is really meant to seem like part of a larger story that could continue in both directions with more material before and after it. In any case, we continue to see everyone in the same pose, basically that they were from the beginning, which is to say the angle, the camera angle, if you imagine there's a camera filming this, has not really changed much from the beginning to the end. I've allowed myself to gradually zoom in, that's the one thing. But, you know, there's some people who will just stick with this approach all the way through and never zoom in. That being said, we are going to do a lot more interesting things in the second version of this comic strip page. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Okay, so here we have the first two panels, and you can see, of course, that I put considerably more time into them to begin with than I did with this. But these are done in two different styles. I would say this is done in almost like a newspaper comic strip style, this one. And this is more like my own comic book style would be if I were doing this for publication. So one thing to point out is that we're not covering the same material in these two panels. I only get so far as the ding-dong here, whereas in the other one we get the ding-dong in the very first panel, and he's walking to the door in the second panel. Well, this just shows you that you've got choices as a comic book creator in terms of what you do with the panels, how many panels are needed for what. Now, why is this panel so wide? Because to me it's a little bit of an establishing shot. I want to give you the feeling of what it's like to be in this guy's living room, so I've added this table and stuff like that. This one sort of is more bare bones. We don't need to feel like we're in the living room. He's sitting in a chair. It's enough. He's in his house. We get it. You know, I'm using a perspective scheme here, different stuff like that. This is just my way that I would do things. One interesting thing to point out is that I changed ding dong to ting tong, which is my preference. I don't like to use cookie cutter pre-existing sound effects like ding dong, which you almost could look up in the dictionary. I like to turn them into words that you can't find in the dictionary, at least as far as I know. You can't find ting-tong. It is only a sound effect and nothing else. But I think from the beginning we're getting a little more of a feeling of mystery here. Oh, he was not expecting anyone, right? Whereas in this first one, we don't get any emotional reaction from him with the doorbell ringing, and that's just, you know, I suppose you can't, when you're so far away, see his face, and that's part of why I created this panel where we zoom in quite tightly and realize, as part of the storytelling, oh, this is not an expected visitor. Let's move on now to this next row of panels, and I think you're going to see that we make even more drastic changes. All right, so you can see lots of different changes here. The main thing being that we've got 3 panels instead of 2. And that we've zoomed in real close just to show the hand turning the doorknob here. I think it's always interesting when you've got a series of panels that show faces and sort of upper bodies to get one panel in which we get a zoom in on something else, in this case the hand on the doorknob. Also, it sort of delays this moment of revelation. Here we've started to wonder, oh, who could that be? And we get a panel that is pretty close to this panel, really, just I think from a slightly more interesting angle. And then this delays that moment of opening the door. And before we get to this last panel, which is one of my favorite things to do, here we have done the most drastic change of angle. We've actually moved outside of the house and are looking back in. Part of this is determined by me wanting to see that look of surprise on his face, and also to keep David here a little bit more of a mystery for a slightly longer time. But also, anytime I think that you can change the angle, the point of view drastically, it's worth considering. again, to break up the sort of repetition of, you know, interior of the house, interior of the house. Oh boy, now suddenly we're on the exterior of the house. Well, let's move on and get into the last panels that will complete this page, this two-page comparison of the exact same scene. Okay, so these are the final two panels, and here we've got quite a different angle here, I think, compared to almost anything we've seen here. We've taken the camera up a little high above the two characters, so as to see from kind of above the man's shoulder down towards David. This gives us more of a complete view of David, and I suppose it's a little unfair because in this one I didn't choose to show him holding fishing line, which I probably could have snuck in there, but I think because of the way I set this up, there's just not that much space for it, whereas here we get to toss those in, and I think it adds to the humor, doesn't it, if we actually see him having arrived with the fishing pole in the tackle box. He's all ready to go, based on the guy having said, "Someday I'll take you fishing." And so, yeah, this is yet again an angle that's kind of determined by what we want the viewer to see, and also just sort of cutting up the panel in the most interesting way. I think coming up and getting an elevated point of view allows us to get some interesting diagonal lines and so forth that make this a kind of a more dynamic and visually interesting image. And then, of course, here, this is more or less my standard go-to when the emotion of the character is important. I zoom in so that we get a good look at the guy's face. I'm going to tighten up these lower eyelids. For some reason that adds something to the degree of hostility being displayed here. You might have seen that I had the mouth open even wider for a minute there, and it just seemed like he was bellowing too loudly for the situation, for the amount of annoyance that he felt. So I reduced the size of the mouth. This kind of thing is very common for me, tweaking facial expressions and so forth, so as to get the humor the best it can be. Well, I am going to pull the camera way back so that we can see both of these illustration styles side by side. All right, well, there you have it, two different pages that are derived from the same script. And, you know, as I said, this one I clearly put a lot more time into. This one is done in a much more simplistic way, but I do think it is in keeping with that sort of 6-panel approach. It's almost expected that you're going to be a little more stripped back and keeping it like a classic old-fashioned newspaper comic strip. Whereas this, as I said, this is kind of my way of how I would create a page for publication. This, of course, not being ready for publication, it would need to be inked and colored and all that good stuff. But before I go, I always like to say thank you to anyone who has supported me by getting any of my books. Like the comic book lesson, this book definitely has all of my best advice about creating comics. Mastering Manga 1, 2, and 3, these also have a lot of information about page layouts and different comic book storytelling techniques. And my very latest book, Lost in Taiwan, I'm thrilled to say that a Taiwanese edition is coming out just around the time that you see this video. So greetings to anyone in Taiwan if you've picked up the Chinese language edition of Lost in Taiwan. Very, very excited about that new publication. But I think it's time for me to lay down this pencil, and thank you all one more time for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one real soon.